It's a reminder of several old stories that give us the possibility of bringing finality and answering the questions that have arisen out of our exploration into the nature of divine psychology. The questions are, where and what is this psyche? And what difference, if any, is there between the psychology perhaps of a Jung and a Freud and the like, and what has been coined as divine psychology? The first story is that story about Mullah Nasruddin, and every day he would meet his friend at the coffee shop and they would sit at their usual table under the awning on the street outside the cafe. And every day at the same time a small orphan boy would come by and knock Mullah Nasruddin's turban off his head so that it rolled in the dust by the side of the road. Every day his friend would say to him, "Why don't you take that little ruffian by the scruff of his neck and give him a good clout?" And Mullah Nasruddin would reply, "Oh, wait, there is a greater power at work here." A few days later, when Mullah Nasruddin and his friend met at the coffee shop, their table was taken by a soldier in full regalia, epaulets shining, his helmet with its tassel, his sword in its sheath by his side. And like clockwork, the little waif came by and knocked the soldier's helmet off his head. And in the blink of an eye, the little waif's head went rolling into the dust at the side of the road. Mullah Nasruddin turned to his companion and said, "You see, I told you that there was a greater power at work here." And the second story is about that king who woke on a very sultry evening after him tossing and turning in his satin sheets, and following a pattern that he had from time to time, he got up and he dressed himself in peasant's garbs and went out to wander the streets of his kingdom. But as he was wandering, his feet were drawn to a little alleyway, and as he came to that alleyway, he saw at the end of the alley a rather dilapidated little house with a single candle shining in its window. So he walked down the alleyway, and as he approached the house, there was a distinct feeling of serenity and peacefulness that drew his feet to the doorway of the house. And when he knocked, an old man answered and asked, "Well, who are you?" And the king in disguise, "So I'm just a wanderer seeking hospitality." And the old man invited him in. On the table was a simple meal of a salad and some bread and wine. And the king in disguise was invited to join the old man and his wife in their simple repast. But as they sat, it seemed to the king in disguise that along with the feeling of peace and serenity, that seemed to be throughout this whole place. He felt that he could hear almost a silent hum coming from the old couple. But in the course of the meal, of course, the king asked the old man what was his livelihood, and the old man replied that he was a cobbler, that he wandered the streets, and anyone who needed their shoes mended, he would mend them. But the king inquired of the old man, "Well, I see that you are quite old, and perhaps you won't be able to ply your trade indefinitely. You don't obviously have any children. What will you do?" And the old man, with somewhat of an enigmatic smile on his face, said, "Oh, I don't have concern. I have faith in a greater power." So after the repast, and the king taking his leave and saying, "Can I come back and visit you again?" To the affirmative of the elderly couple. And then he left. But the king decided that he was going to test this old man's faith. So the very next day, he sent out an edict that no one was allowed to go about the streets mending shoes. No cobblers allowed in the town. So when the old man went out in the streets to ply his trade and learned of this edict, he was somewhat in a quandary. But then he saw several men carrying buckets of water down the road. So immediately he thought, "I can become a water carrier." So he got himself some buckets and plied this trade throughout the day, carrying water to the people. But that night, the king in disguise visited him again and asked him what had happened after the king had brought out his edict that no cobblers were allowed. The old man explained that he'd become a water carrier and made as much carrying water as he had. So he had enough to put a meal on the table for himself and his wife. So of course again, with the intent of testing this old man's faith, the very next day the king sent out a law that no one was allowed to carry water. People had to carry their own water. So when the old man went out with his buckets, he found that he could no longer do so. But then happenstance was it that there were some wood choppers passing down the street with axes across their shoulders, heading for the forest to gather wood. So immediately the old man traded in his buckets and got himself an axe and went with the wood choppers out to gather wood, and again made enough to put food on the table for himself and his wife. Again that night the king in disguise came to him and asked him, "Well, how did you fare?" And the old man told him the story. But the king, not to be thwarted, the very next day ordered his soldiers to gather in all of the wood choppers that they found in the town and bring them to his palace, put them in uniforms and give them a sword to make them the guards of his palace. So of course it so happened our old man was amongst these wood choppers who were taken to the palace given a uniform and a sword and ordered to guard the king's palace. But it was found at the end of the day that soldiers were only paid once a month, and so the old man had no money to buy food, since it was early in the month. So when he went back to his house with no money for food, he was in a dilemma. But then he looked up and he saw the fancy sword that had been given to him as part of his uniform, and he had a thought. So he immediately took a piece of wood and honed it in the shape of the sword, placed it in the sheath, and took the king's sword to town and sold it for a goodly sum, and was able to provide food for his table. When the king came that evening in disguise and asked the old man, he explained what he had done. The king said nothing, but the very next day the king sent out an order that everyone was to be gathered in the town square, because there was to be an execution of someone who had broken the law. So of course amongst that throng there was the old man in his uniform as the guard. But as the accused was put up on the dais, the king gave an order and pointed to the old man. He will be the executioner. So the soldier went down and accosted the old man and said he was to wield the sword that lopped the head of the accused. The old man said, "But I've never killed anyone in my life." The soldier said, "If you do not obey the king, your own head will be lopped from your shoulders." So the old man was escorted up to the dais where the king, his entourage, and the accused stood. So the old man, confronting his fate, asked for a moment, and in standing on that dais, he put his hand on his heart and then looked up, and he said loud and clear to the whole throng gathered there, "It is known that I have never killed anyone in my life, but I say, if this man is guilty, let my sword be sharp and true, but if he is innocent, let my sword be turned to wood." So putting his hand on the sword, he drew it out and held it up, and the crowd cheered to see the sword of wood above the old man's head. The king called the old man over to him and said, "Look at me, who am I?" And the old man looked and said, "Oh, you're my guest of the last 4 evenings. And the king said to the old man, and now you will be my guest, because with your faith and your wisdom, I have need of you as an advisor in my palace. Where and what is our psyche? What difference is any between the ordinary known psyche and what it is that's been coined as the divine psychology? What is divine psychology for you? And how did these simple stories give us the answer?